The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Frank Miller adjusted his weathered veteran's cap and pushed open the heavy glass door of Sally's diner. The bell chimed softly, announcing his arrival just as it had every morning for the past 30 years. At 93, Frank moved slower than he used to, but his military bearing remained evident in his straight posture and determined stride. "The usual, Frank," called Sally from behind the counter, her warm smile bringing light to the cozy establishment. She had already started pouring his black coffee into his favorite blue mug, the one with the navy insignia that the diner kept specially for him. "You know me too well, Sally," Frank replied, settling into his regular booth by the window. From here, he could watch the town wake up, just as he had done since moving to Henderson, Nebraska, after his wife Margaret passed away in 1990. The familiar routine brought him comfort, and the diner had become his second home. The morning started like any other, with Frank sipping his coffee and working on the daily crossword puzzle. However, the peaceful atmosphere was suddenly shattered by the thunderous roar of motorcycle engines. The windows of Sally's diner vibrated as 5 heavily customized motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome fixtures gleaming menacingly in the morning light. The bikers who entered were nothing like the friendly motorcycle enthusiasts who sometimes passed through town. These men wore tattered leather vests covered in aggressive patches, their faces hard and unwelcoming. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and arms covered in dark tattoos, scanned the diner with cold eyes until his gaze settled on Frank. Well, what do we have here?" The leader sneered, walking over to Frank's booth. "Looks like we found ourselves a relic." His companion snickered, spreading out around the diner in a way that made the other customers visibly uncomfortable. Frank remained calm, focusing on his crossword puzzle. His weathered hands, which had once served aboard a destroyer in World War II, remained steady as he filled in another word. He'd faced far worse than playground bullies in his 93 years. "When I'm talking to you, old-timer, you should show some respect," the biker growled, deliberately knocking Frank's coffee cup off the table. The blue mug shattered on the floor, dark coffee spreading across the worn linoleum. Sally rushed forward with a towel, her face flushed with anger. "Now see here," she started, but Frank gently raised his hand, stopping her. "It's all right, Sally," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Some people never learn proper manners." He reached for his wallet, placed enough money on the table to cover his bill on the broken mug, and stood up slowly. The bikers laughed as Frank made his way to the door, throwing insults about his age and making exaggerated impressions of his careful walking pace. But what they didn't notice was the sharp intelligence in Frank's eyes as he observed each of their faces, memorized their tattoos, and took note of the patches on their vests that identified their gang affiliation. As Frank walked to his meticulously maintained 1947 Ford pickup truck, he could hear the bikers still laughing inside the diner. He hadn't survived the Pacific Theater by being reckless or reactive. In his experience, the best strategy was to observe, plan, and wait for the right moment. These young troublemakers had no idea who they were dealing with. Driving home, Frank's mind was already working, drawing on skills he hadn't needed to use in decades. While others might see a frail old veteran, he was already formulating a plan. The military had taught him patience and strategy, and life had taught him that sometimes the best response to a bully wasn't immediate confrontation, but careful, methodical action. At home, Frank went straight to his study, where photographs of his naval service hung alongside pictures of his late wife. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook, his hand steady as he began to write down everything he had observed about the bikers. This was just the beginning, and Frank Miller was nothing if not thorough. Over the next 2 weeks, the bikers made it their mission to torment Frank Miller. They seemed to take special pleasure in targeting the elderly veteran, showing up at Sally's diner almost every morning. Each day, their actions grew bolder and more disrespectful, but Frank maintained his composed exterior, which only seemed to frustrate them more. One misty morning, Frank stepped out of his house to find his beloved 1947 Ford pickup truck vandalized. The pristine blue paint that he meticulously maintained was now scratched with crude words, and all 4 tires were flat. The sight made his heart heavy. This vehicle wasn't just transportation. It was one of his strongest connections to Margaret. They had bought it together when they first married, and she had loved that truck almost as much as he did. "You okay there, Frank?" called out Tom Wilson, his next-door neighbor, hurrying over with concern written across his face. I heard some noise last night. By the time I looked out, all I saw were motorcycle taillights disappearing down the street. Frank nodded slowly, his jaw set firmly. I'm fine, Tom. Nothing that can't be fixed. But inside, something had shifted. The bikers had crossed a line they shouldn't have. That afternoon, instead of working in his garden as he usually did, Frank went down to his basement. In a corner, covered by an old sheet, sat several boxes he hadn't opened in years. With careful movements, he pulled out his old military footlocker. The lock was stiff from disuse, but the combination came to his fingers naturally, some things you never forget. Inside, beneath his neatly folded uniform, lay his military intelligence manuals and notebooks from his days as a naval intelligence officer. Most people assumed Frank had just been a regular sailor, but there was much more to his service than he usually shared. During the war, he had specialized in gathering and analyzing intelligence about enemy movements and operations. Frank spent the rest of the day reviewing his old notes and techniques. That evening, he made several phone calls to old military buddies who had settled in neighboring towns. Each conversation ended with a quiet agreement and a shared understanding of the task at hand. The next morning, Frank didn't go to the diner. Instead, he drove his wife's old Buick, which he kept in the garage, to the hardware store and bought several small cameras and a new laptop. Items his grandchildren had been urging him to get familiar with for years. When the young store clerk offered to help him set them up, Frank politely declined. He might be old, but his mind was as sharp as ever. Over the next few days, Frank established a routine that would have made his old commanding officer proud. He set up surveillance points around town, marking the bikers' regular haunts on a detailed map. His fellow veterans, positioned in strategic locations, helped gather information about the gang's movements and activities. What emerged was a disturbing pattern. The bikers weren't just random troublemakers. They were running a sophisticated drug operation using their motorcycle club as a cover. Their harassment of Frank and other elderly residents was just a way to intimidate the community into looking the other way. Frank documented everything meticulously. His military training in intelligence gathering proved invaluable as he built a comprehensive file on the gang's operations. He noted delivery times, meeting locations, and even managed to photograph several suspicious exchanges behind the old warehouse at the edge of town. One evening, while reviewing his notes, Frank heard the rumble of motorcycles approaching his house. Instead of turning on his porch light as he usually did, he sat in darkness, watching through his window as three of the bikers circled his property like vultures. They were trying to intimidate him, but they didn't realize they were playing right into his hands. As the bikers roared away, Frank smiled slightly. In his days as an intelligence officer, he had learned that the key to defeating an enemy wasn't always through direct confrontation. Sometimes, the most effective strategy was to let them think they had the upper hand while quietly gathering the evidence needed to bring them down. As Frank's investigation deepened, he discovered that the local police department's reluctance to act against the bikers wasn't just about intimidation. Through careful observation and his growing network of veteran friends, he uncovered troubling connections between the gang and certain members of local law enforcement. One rainy afternoon, while Frank was reviewing his surveillance photos at home, he heard a gentle knock at his door. Opening it cautiously, he found Officer Sarah Chen, a young police officer he'd often seen at Sally's diner. Her expression was worried as she glanced over her shoulder before speaking. "Mr. Miller, may I come in?" she asked quietly. "There are some things you need to know." Inside, over a cup of coffee, Officer Chen confirmed Frank's suspicions. The police chief and several senior officers were receiving payoffs from the biker gang to look the other way. She had tried reporting it to Internal Affairs, but her concerns had been brushed aside. "I've seen how they've been treating you and others in town," she said, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. "I became a police officer to protect people, not to watch criminals run free." Frank listened carefully, his mind already working on how this new information fit into his broader strategy. "Tell me, Officer Chen, would you be willing to help me do something about this situation? It won't be easy, and it could be dangerous." Sarah's eyes lit up with determination. "That's exactly why I came to you, Mr. Miller. Some of the older officers mentioned your military background. I thought maybe you'd know what to do." Over the next hour, Frank shared some of his findings with Sarah, carefully gauging her reactions. He'd learned in the Navy that choosing the right allies was crucial to any operation's success. In Officer Chen, he recognized the same sense of justice and dedication to juvie that he'd seen in his best fellow officers during the war. Together, they developed a plan. Sarah would provide Frank with information about police patrol patterns and any upcoming operations that might affect the gang, while Frank would continue gathering evidence through his surveillance network. They agreed to be extremely careful in their communications, knowing that discovery could be dangerous for both of them. That evening, after Sarah left, Frank made a secure call to one of his old military contacts who now worked with the FBI. The evidence he'd gathered, combined with Officer Chen's insider information about police corruption, was exactly what the federal authorities needed to launch a proper investigation. The next few days tested Frank's patience and resolve. The bikers, emboldened by their apparent immunity, became even more aggressive. They started following him when he drove around town, revving their engines and making threatening gestures. At the diner, they graduated from knocking over his coffee to accidentally shoving him as they passed his booth. But Frank maintained his calm exterior, playing the role of a frightened elderly man perfectly. Each act of intimidation was carefully documented and added to his growing file of evidence. His veteran friends, positioned strategically around town, photographed the bikers' every move, building an undeniable record of their harassment and criminal activities. One night, as Frank was adding new information to his files, he heard the distinctive sound of breaking glass from his front porch. Staying away from the windows, he moved silently through his darkened house to his security camera feed. The screen showed 3 bikers vandalizing his front porch, spray painting threatening messages on his walls. Instead of calling the corrupted local police, Frank contacted Officer Chen through their predetermined secure channel. She arrived quickly but waited until the bikers had left before approaching his house, maintaining their ruse of non-cooperation. As they documented the damage, Frank noticed a slight smile on his face. The bikers had just made a crucial mistake. One of them had removed his gloves while spray painting, leaving perfect fingerprints on the wall. Sometimes, he reflected, the best strategy was to let your opponents think they were winning, right up until the moment they lost everything. The FBI's involvement brought a new level of sophistication to Frank's operation. His contact, Special Agent Marcus Thompson, was impressed by the detailed intelligence Frank had gathered. During a secure meeting at Frank's house, disguised as a visit from his nephew, Agent Thompson reviewed the evidence. "This is remarkable work, Mr. Miller," Thompson said, examining the surveillance photos and detailed notes. "Your military intelligence training certainly hasn't gone rusty. But I need to warn you, these people are more dangerous than you might realize." Frank nodded, pulling out another folder from his desk. "I know. Take a look at this." He spread out a series of photographs showing the gang's connections to larger criminal organizations in 3 neighboring states. His veteran network had been thorough in their surveillance. What surprised Agent Thompson most was the sophisticated money trail Frank had uncovered. Through careful observation of delivery patterns and some old-fashioned detective work, Frank had mapped out how the gang was laundering their drug money through several legitimate businesses in town. "The auto repair shop on 5th Street," Frank explained, pointing to his notes. "They process fake repair bills. And the new gym downtown, it reports 3 times the actual membership numbers. Classic money laundering operations." As they talked, Officer Chen arrived with more disturbing news. The gang was planning something big. A major drug shipment was coming in, and they were getting bolder about flaunting their police protection. "They're having a big meeting tomorrow night," Sarah reported. "All the corrupt officers will be there, along with the gang's leadership. They're celebrating their expansion in the territory." Frank's eyes lit up with a familiar gleam, the same look he'd had during crucial operations in the Pacific. "That's our opportunity," he said, spreading a town map on his desk, "if we can catch them all together." Agent Thompson agreed. "This could be perfect timing. We've been building our case, and with your evidence combined with what we gathered, we can make a clean sweep. But Mr. Miller, you need to stay clear when this goes down. These aren't just local thugs, they're dangerous criminals." Frank smiled slightly, remembering similar warnings he'd received before dangerous missions during the war. "Don't worry about me, Agent Thompson. I know how to stay out of sight, but there's one thing I need to do first." The next morning, breaking his recent pattern, Frank returned to Sally's diner. As expected, several gang members were there, including their leader. They started their usual harassment as soon as he walked in, but this time, Frank didn't quietly take it. "Young man," he said clearly, addressing the gang leader, "I faced down Japanese destroyers in the Pacific. Do you really think you scare me?" The diner went silent. The gang leader stood up, his face dark with anger. "You're making a big mistake, old man. Nobody talks to me like that." Frank stood his ground, looking directly into the biker's eyes. "I fought for this country when I was younger than you. I've seen real courage and real cowardice. Want to guess which one I'm seeing now?" The gang leader lunged forward, but Frank didn't flinch. Several other customers quickly pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation. Officer Chen, who happened to be having coffee at the counter, stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" she asked professionally. The gang leader glared at Frank but backed away. "No problem. The old man's just talking nonsense, but he better watch his back." Frank calmly sat down at his usual booth, ordered his coffee, and opened his newspaper. Everything was going according to plan. The gang's reaction to this sudden defiance would make them sloppy, emotional, and more likely to make mistakes at tonight's meeting. Sometimes, the best strategy was to let your opponent's anger cloud their judgment. The evening of the gang's meeting arrived with an unusual stillness in the air. Frank sat in his study, surrounded by surveillance equipment, monitoring the operation through a sophisticated communication network he'd set up with his veteran friends. Each was positioned strategically around the old warehouse where the meeting would take place. "Eagle's Nest to watch points. Check in." Frank spoke quietly into his radio, using the call signs they'd established. One by one, his fellow veterans reported their positions. Despite their age, these men hadn't forgotten their military training. Through his earpiece, Frank could hear Agent Thompson coordinating with the FBI tactical teams. They were positioned just outside town, waiting for the right moment. Officer Chen was maintaining radio silence, having gone to the meeting as part of the corrupt police contingent, wearing a hidden wire. At 8:45 p.m., motorcycles began arriving at the warehouse. Frank's cameras captured each face, matching them against the profiles he built over the past weeks. Then came the police cruisers, parking in the shadows behind the building. Everything was proceeding exactly as they'd anticipated. "Watch point 3 to Eagle's Nest," crackled Frank's radio. It was Tom Wilson, his neighbor and fellow Navy veteran. "Big truck approaching from the north. Matches the description of their supply vehicle." Frank checked his monitors. The semi-truck was right on schedule, just as Officer Chen had informed them. This was the major drug shipment they'd been waiting for. He relayed the information to Agent Thompson. Through Officer Chen's wire, they could hear the meeting beginning. The gang leader was boasting about their success in taking over the town, mocking the residents who lived in fear. Frank's jaw tightened as he heard them laughing about harassing him at the diner. "And that old man thinks he can stand up to us," the leader sneered. "Maybe it's time we taught him a permanent lesson." Suddenly, there was a commotion in the meeting. One of the gang members burst in, panicking. "Boss, we got company, feds, they're everywhere." Frank watched through his monitors as chows erupted. The FBI tactical teams had begun their move, surrounding the warehouse with precision. Agent Thompson's voice came through clear and professional on the radio. "All units, move in. Remember, we have an undercover officer inside." The next few minutes were intense. Frank observed as the FBI teams breached the warehouse from multiple points. The corrupt police officers, caught completely off guard, didn't even reach for their weapons. The gang members tried to flee but found every exit blocked. Through it all, Frank maintained his calm, coordinating with his veteran network to ensure no one slipped through their surveillance net. Years of military intelligence work had taught him the importance of maintaining control during chaos. Officer Chen's voice came through the wire, steady and clear. "Officer Chen, CPD. I have the gang leader in custody." The pride in her voice was evident, and Frank smiled. She had played her part perfectly. Within 30 minutes, it was over. The warehouse was secured, and the arrests were underway. Frank watched as the FBI let out a long line of suspects, gang members, corrupt officers, and even the police chief himself. The semi-truck, when searched, revealed enough evidence to put them away for decades. Agent Thompson's voice crackled over the radio. "Mr. Miller, you can come down now. It's all clear." Frank stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting so long at his monitoring station. As he drove to the warehouse, he passed several of his veteran friends heading home, each giving him a subtle nod. Their mission was accomplished. At the scene, red and blue lights painted the night sky as local news crews began arriving. Frank parked quietly at the edge of the activity, content to watch from a distance. Officer Chen spotted him and walked over, still in her tactical gear. "We did it, Mr. Miller," she said, her eyes shining with accomplishment. "Your plan worked perfectly." The morning after the raid, Sally's diner was buzzing with excitement. Every table was filled as townspeople gathered to discuss the dramatic events of the previous night. Frank sat in his usual booth, sipping his coffee from a new Navy mug Sally had given him to replace the one the bikers had broken. "I still can't believe it," Sally said, refilling his cup. "All this time, you were working with the FBI, and here we were, worried sick about you facing those thugs alone." Her voice carried a mixture of admiration and gentle scolding. Frank simply smiled, focusing on his crossword puzzle just as he had done every morning. But now, other customers kept stopping by his booth, patting his shoulder or sharing words of thanks. The local newspaper lay on his table, its headline bold and clear. "FBI raid brings down criminal gang and PRUPOATHRCRs. Elderly veterans intelligence work key to success." Agent Thompson arrived at the diner around mid-morning, dressed in a casual suit rather than his tactical gear. He slid into the booth across from Frank, ordering coffee from Sally. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is thrilled," Thompson reported quietly. "Your evidence is rock solid. The gang's entire operation is exposed, including their connections in other states. We're looking at federal charges that will put them away for decades." Frank nodded, thinking of all the other small towns that would now be safer, and the corrupt officers. "They're singing like canaries," Thompson smiled. "Trying to make deals, but with the evidence we have, they're all facing serious time." Officer Chen's testimony is the final nail in their coffin. As they talked, Frank noticed a group of motorcycle riders pulling into the diner's parking lot. For a moment, the other customers tensed, but these weren't gang members. They were veterans, many wearing American Legion patches, who had heard about Frank's story on the morning news. The veterans filed into the diner, respectfully approaching Frank's booth. Their leader, a Vietnam War veteran named Mike, stepped forward. "Mr. Miller," Mike said, standing at attention, "we read about what you did. How you protected this town using the same skills you used to protect our country. We wanted to show our respect." One by one, the veterans saluted Frank. Some were older, some younger, but all shared the same look of profound respect. Frank stood slowly, returning their salutes with the precision that decades couldn't erase. The scene drew attention from outside. Local news crews, who had been reporting on the aftermath of the raid, captured the moment through the diner's windows. By evening, the story would spread across the state, not just of the raid, but of the veterans honoring one of their own. Later that afternoon, Mayor Roberts visited Frank at home. The mayor, who had been unaware of the police corruption, was still shaken by the revelations. "Mr. Miller," he began, settling into an armchair in Frank's study. "The town council and I have been discussing how to prevent something like this from happening again. We'd like your help." Frank raised an eyebrow, waiting for the mayor to continue. "We want to establish a citizen oversight committee for the police department," the mayor explained. "And we'd like you to chair it. Your military intelligence background, your integrity, you're exactly what this town needs." Frank looked at the wall where his military photos hung, his eyes settling on a picture of his young self in naval intelligence training. Next to it was a more recent photo of him with Officer Chen at Sally's diner, taken just a week before the raid. "Mr. Mayor," Frank replied thoughtfully, "I'd be honored. But on one condition: Officer Chen should be our liaison with the department. She proved herself when it mattered most." The mayor readily agreed, and as he left, Frank sat back in his chair, feeling satisfied. Sometimes, he reflected, life's greatest missions come when you least expect them, and age is no barrier to making a difference. In the weeks following the raid, Frank's quiet life transformed in ways he never expected. His story had caught national attention, and reporters from major news networks were constantly requesting interviews. But Frank, true to his nature, declined most of them, preferring to focus on his new responsibilities with the Citizen Oversight Committee. One morning, as Frank walked into Sally's diner, he found an unexpected visitor waiting in his usual booth. It was Admiral James Peterson, this former commanding officer from his Navy days, now in his late 80s but still carrying himself with military bearing. "Miller," the Admiral said, standing to greet him. 50 years later, and you're still running intelligence operations." There was pride in his voice as he shook Frank's hand. They spent the morning talking over coffee, reminiscing about their service days and discussing how Frank had applied his military training to protect his town. Sally kept their cups filled, listening intently to stories of naval operations that had never made it into history books. "The Secretary of the Navy heard about what you did," Admiral Peterson mentioned casually. "They're considering presenting you with a Civilian Service Award. Your actions here, they're exactly what we trained for, protecting American citizens, whether on foreign shores or right here at home." Frank felt honored but remained modest. "I just did what needed to be done, sir. Same as we always did." That afternoon, Frank had his first official meeting with the Citizen Oversight Committee. The town hall conference room was packed with community members eager to participate. Officer Chen, now promoted to sergeant, stood beside him as he addressed the crowd. "What happened in our town wasn't just about corrupt officers or criminal gangs," Frank began, his voice clear and strong. "It was about citizens choosing to look away because they felt helpless. That ends today." He outlined his plans for the committee: regular meetings with police leadership, transparent complaint procedures, and community engagement programs. His military experience in intelligence and strategy was proving invaluable in organizing these civilian operations. After the meeting, a group of high school students approached Frank. They were working on a project about civic responsibility and wanted to interview him. Frank agreed, seeing an opportunity to pass on important lessons to the next generation. "The biggest mistake people make," he told them, "is thinking they're too old, too young, or too powerless to make a difference. But when you see something wrong, you have a choice: look away or take action." The students recorded his words eagerly, and one of them asked, "Weren't you scared, Mr. Miller, when the gang was threatening you?" Frank thought carefully before answering. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right despite being scared. In the Navy, we learned that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about facing your fears for something more important than yourself." That evening, as Frank drove home in his newly restored pickup truck, repaired and repainted by grateful community members, he noticed something different about his town. People were out on their porches again, children were playing in their yards, and neighbors were chatting with each other on street corners. The fear that had gripped the town was gone, replaced by a new sense of community strength. Frank's actions had done more than just bring down criminals. They had reminded people of their own power to stand up against wrongdoing. At home, Frank found a package waiting on his porch. Inside was a framed photograph from Sally's diner, showing him with Officer Chen and his veteran friends who had helped with the surveillance. Below it was a simple inscription: "To the man who taught us that heroes don't retire." Frank hung the photo next to his military pictures, thinking about how life had come full circle. The skills he'd learned defending his country as a young man had helped him protect his community as an elder citizen. It proved what he had always believed: that age was just a number, and courage never grew old. 6 months after the raid, Henderson had become a model for small-town community policing. Frank's oversight committee had helped implement changes that transformed the police department into one of the most transparent and trusted in the state. But for Frank, the most significant change was much more personal. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted past Sally's diner's windows, Frank walked in to find the place decorated with balloons and streamers. A banner hung across the counter reading, "Happy 94th birthday, Frank." Sally, Officer Chen, now Sergeant Chen, and dozens of community members were waiting to surprise him. "You didn't think we'd forget, did you?" Sally asked, leading him to his usual booth, which had been decorated with navy blue ribbons and American flags. Among the guests was Agent Thompson, who had driven up from the FBI field office. He carried news that made Frank's birthday even more special. "The last trials ended yesterday," Thompson announced to the gathered crowd. "Every single gang member and corrupt officer has been convicted. The judge specifically mentioned your testimony and evidence in his final statement." The diner erupted in applause, but Frank's attention was drawn to a group of young people entering the restaurant. They were teenagers who had started a community watch program inspired by his example. They called themselves Miller's Watch, though Frank had insisted they didn't need to use his name. Mr. Miller, their leader, a 15-year-old named Sarah Martinez, approached his table. "We wanted to show you something." She opened a laptop, displaying a map of their town with dozens of green dots. Each dot represents a new neighborhood watch group. "We've helped organize them across town, just like you taught us." Frank studied the map, touched by how his actions had inspired the younger generation. The teenagers had taken his lessons about community responsibility and expanded them beyond anything he had imagined. Mayor Roberts stood up to make an announcement. As of this morning, the town council has unanimously voted to rename the Citizen Oversight Committee to the Frank Miller Community Safety Initiative. Furthermore, we're establishing an annual scholarship in your name, Mr. Miller, for students pursuing careers in public service or law enforcement. The surprise announcements continued. Sergeant Chen stepped forward with several other officers. "The police department has created a new community liaison program," she explained. "Each officer will spend time meeting with residents, building relationships, and learning from our citizens. We're calling it the Miller Method, because you taught us that true security comes from understanding and working with our community." As the celebration continued, Frank's veteran friends presented him with a special gift, a restored World War II Naval Intelligence Manual, signed by everyone who had helped with the surveillance operation. Inside, they had written personal messages about how his leadership had given them a renewed sense of purpose. "You reminded us that veterans never stop serving," Tom Wilson said, speaking for the group. "We might be older, but we still have so much to offer our community." The party lasted well into the afternoon, with people sharing stories about how the town had changed. Crime rates had dropped significantly, but more importantly, there was a new sense of connection among the residents. People looked out for each other now, following the example Frank had set. As the celebration wound down, Frank sat quietly in his booth, watching the sunset through the diner's windows. Sally brought him a fresh cup of coffee in his navy mug, now joined by a new one gifted by the police department. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from him. Frank smiled, looking around at the community he had helped transform. "I was just thinking about how life surprises you," he said. "When those bikers first showed up, everyone thought I was vulnerable because of my age. They never realized that with age comes wisdom, experience, and the knowledge of how to fight the right way." "And you taught us all how to fight the right way," Sally replied, "not with fists or weapons, but with courage, intelligence, and community." As Frank drove home that evening, he passed the spot where the old warehouse had stood. It was being converted into a community center, another positive change born from those challenging days. The center would include a veterans meeting space and a youth program room, a perfect symbol of how the past had helped shape a better future for Henderson.